What's up? I'm Troubleshoot. In this quick guide, I'll be talking about optimizing Once Human for the best possible performance, so let's get into it. This game seems pretty inconsistent in performance. The tutorial area had me reaching 100 and something FPS with a 3080 Ti at 2K with the default settings, which is fantastic, but as soon as I got to the actual world itself, things started tanking. As you can see, my performance is moving between 50 to 70, maybe 80 frames at 2K, once again with a very good system, and input latency is terrible. This is leaving a lot of optimization on the table, and it needs quite a bit of tweaking in order to get it working just right, especially if you're playing on lower powered hardware. So let's speak about it. When you first fire up the game, I'd recommend pausing it, heading across to settings, then video, and under the performance section, find yourself the max frame rate and crank it to no restrictions so you can uncap your frames and remove the 60 FPS cap, assuming you're reaching that. Then something else I did was disabling the motion blur as well, as that'll help improve how the game feels. Generally, I'm not a big fan of motion blur, but if you are someone who enjoys it, you can consider leaving it on. VSync should definitely be turned off unless you're getting screen tearing where the top and the bottom half don't match up. And finally, the last thing that I tweaked at the very start of the game was on the mouse and display tab at the very top, followed by control, which is a little bit confusing to get to. Under this section, you'll find camera sensitivity. I completely maxed this out, the sensitivity coefficient, and by doing so, it should change the sensitivity of all of the options below this. You can adjust each manually, which is fantastic, but adjusting the coefficient adjusts everything. Then also disabling mouse smoothing by dragging this to 0 is a good thing to do, especially if you want consistent aiming. That is, of course, unless you're used to mouse acceleration. Now that we have the game in a playable state, how do we get the FPS to come along with us and be playable too? Well, there's a couple of things that we need to change. Hit escape, head across to settings, and we'll start on the video tab here. First of all, display mode should be set to full screen and your resolution should match your display, or at least be a compatible one. Brightness is your preference. Then, heading across to the performance tab at the top, here's where we can get some good settings out of our system. Start with something that should match your general system. If you have a good system, select the higher end, or if you have a not so good system, select the lower end. Then we'll move our way up and down from there. Max frame rate, once again, should be turned to no restrictions. Texture quality should be set to the highest option you have available, which could be very high or medium or something like that, and it should use as much VRAM as necessary, or it can on your graphics card, to get good looking textures everywhere. This shouldn't have much effect on performance, and of course you may need to restart your system between changes, but having this set to low versus very high, in my case, there's no performance difference, and all of the textures should just look generally better. This is usually a freebie that I'd recommend keeping up. Then, render scale should be set to 100%, otherwise things will look rather blurry. Anti-aliasing, I'd recommend cranking all the way down. Shade as well to low, and VFX I'd recommend lowering to high if not middle. Some of the options that you have may be different to mine. These two top options appear to be the same. One of them should be high, so in this case I'll be choosing middle, but high is usually what I'd want to go with here. Not too sure why it's not changing properly. Anyways, middle to high is good here. Then draw distance should be set to as high as possible on your system, especially if you want to see things in the distance, including plays, structures, etc. But in a lot of cases, this can cost you quite a bit of FPS, especially if you're on a very populated, very built-out server. So you may want to lower that if that's your case. I'll start on low, and if things are looking good, I'll come back here and raise the draw distance later. VSync off, motion blur off. Scrolling down, vegetation density should also be set all the way down to the lowest setting, as well as detail at the very bottom. Hitting apply with these last two options set, we should immediately see an improvement in input latency and of course general performance. My FPS is still around 70 to 90-ish, looking in this direction it previously dropped to 50, now it's sitting at a solid 60, and input latency seems to be quite dramatically improved. Obviously, things aren't going to look as good as with higher options, but that's where we'll need to come back and tweak it later on, assuming you're getting playable FPS for now. Now, if you're someone who struggles with motion sickness, I'd recommend on the Mouse and Display tab, followed by Gameplay, lowering the screen shake intensity should help, as well as disabling motion blur under Video and Performance over here. By doing these two simple options, you should help make the game a little bit less motion sickness inducing, especially if you have higher input latency because the game's running at a lower FPS. Once you've changed all of these settings in order to make sure you're getting the best possible performance, I'd recommend restarting your game, but you can only squeeze so much out of this. If for some reason you're still really struggling with FPS, the last thing you should go back and change is the resolution. Unfortunately, I haven't seen something like FSR, DLSS, or any other kind of upscaling on the video section, which is something that should be tended to by the developers. While you can adjust the resolution directly on the Basics tab over here, you can also do it on the Performance tab by adjusting the render scale here. If I lower this to as low as possible, which is 60, and it's super blurry, but it has doubled my FPS. This isn't the best thing to do, and I wouldn't recommend cranking it down as low, especially if you're only playing at 1080p. Dropping to 75 is quite a bit better, and we still get a good improvement in performance. However, things don't look the best. Something else that we can do is implement our own upscaling using something called lossless scaling, which I've covered in a previous video, but there are free alternatives. If I were to pause the game, settings, change the video render scale to be 100%, and change the resolution instead to something like 1080p, which is one step down on my display, we should see a good improvement in performance. But we can squeeze some extra quality and even add frame generation to the game by using third-party tools. Unfortunately, due to the way that it works, I can't really show you in my recording software, but if I were to open up lossless scaling, enable frame generation, and most importantly, make sure that we have some kind of upscaling selected like FSR, I can choose scale, tap back into the game, and within 5 seconds, it should be scaled up, and probably some kind of frame generation should be added as well. You won't see the difference here. I'll need to take a picture and overlay it on the video later just to show you what kind of difference it makes. So this is 1080p, zooming in 3 times, that's what I see, and enabling lossless scaling, this is 1080 scaled to 2K, and things should be improved a little bit at least. Obviously, there's only so much we can do with third-party tools like lossless scaling, for example, but it should make the game at least a little bit more playable and hopefully improve your FPS. The best improvement, though, can only really come from the developers, and unfortunately, it's just not here quite just yet. For now, as I am getting okay frames, I will be playing at native resolution, 100% render scale, and things look relatively good, even though I'm sitting at 70-ish FPS. On lower pad systems, you're definitely going to struggle with this game, especially if you're playing above 1080p, so, well, that's just something to keep your mind on. This game should improve as time goes, and especially there are a couple of other issues with the game in terms of privacy policy, etc., but I'm not even going to get into that. If you're interested in playing the game, this is how you improve the performance as much as we can now, and even add upscaling to it, which we currently don't have a version of in-game, as far as I know. And of course, as we only covered the game here, if you want extra performance from your system, check the description down below for a Windows 10, 11, as well as NVIDIA optimization guides and a couple of other things that may be useful. Thank you all for watching. Mine's been Troubleshoot, and I'll see you all next time. Ciao. And a special thank you to Superior Emerald for still being an ultimate supporter.